then once you do have that established artistry of your own, you sort of have the ironic flip side where it's like no matter how much you may want to sound like artist X, Y, or Z,
Yeah.
you are inescapably yourself, you know.
Well, especially when you have such a unique voice, which you do. I was going to talk to you about that quickly.
Thanks.
I don't do intros with my podcast. I just start because I find
Oh yeah.
it's more natural for me, right? So, but because when I talk to musicians at first, I would be a little bit nervous about saying, "Oh, I really like your voice." But then someone was saying, a musician friend was saying, it's no different really than saying, "I like the way you play guitar," or "I like the way you play a ride cymbal," or whatever it might be, because your voice is still an instrument. And then, like I said, what I did was because we got connected by Mark Lindsay, who sort of said we should speak to Matt. He's covers a lot of Tom Petty. He's a great guy. And I said, awesome. So the first thing I did is I went away to not YouTube. I went away to Apple Music and I thought, I'm just going to listen first, because if I listen without seeing you or without seeing videos, those kinds of things, then I'm just listening to the music purely, right? And the first thing that rings out straight away is like, well, this guy's got a voice like nobody else. He doesn't sound like anyone else. So that straight away, I'm sure you're the same. Like, if the voice isn't right in the band, I'm not going to listen to the band. No matter how
Yeah.
good the music is, if the voice isn't there, then
Totally.
I was like, totally, I love this guy's voice. Can't wait to talk to him. So that was my starting point with your music.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, certainly what you say about being able to go into listening or watching without information would be such a wonderful way to experience so many things. Like I talk about how I'd love to be able to see a movie without knowing who the director is, which
Yeah.
is even more impossible, but still like to be able to extricate yourself from expectation. It would be an amazing thing to be able to do.
I think the only place you can still do that a little bit is with books. And I did that. The last book I read is called If This Book Exists, You're in the Wrong Universe. So it's a really curious, and the title goes like, that sounds interesting. Read the synopsis and bought it on a whim. And so if you can do that, it's like, but with music, you don't really, I don't think you do that, right? Because I think we're all more selective about music. As well, I'm going to pick a rock and roll album, and I know that's good, and I know I like them, so I'll kind of stick with that, and I won't sort of go too far outside my comfort zone. So I think, like I said, books, you can do it a little bit with that. But
Yeah, I think that music is so um, it can fit into different parts of our day so much that
yeah,
it's easier to or if not easier, it's more important that we identify with it, that we can maybe see a part of ourselves in the singer, especially, maybe any band member, but especially the singer, or see a part of them in ourselves. Whereas
yeah.
like a movie or a book, we engage with that for a more finite amount of time, and we can say, well, I like what, this author was doing, but you aren't as concerned with saying this is part of me, I think.
So on that, then, with music, and we'll talk about sort of a little bit of background where you grew up and what you were listening to early. I found that interesting though, because there are definitely, like, Carole King's album Tapestry is a masterpiece. Like, it is one of the best pop albums ever recorded. But I don't really listen to a lot of other Carole King because Tapestry is enough. So sometimes one album from an artist can be enough. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally, yeah. And I mean, we're sort of greedy too. It's like you fall in love with the Tom Petty and they're, I know we'll get into this, but at least a dozen albums that I'd probably listen to wire to wire.
Yeah.
Um, so then when I fatigue of them after one album, I'm like, well, they don't really have it. And it's like, no, like being able to make one great album is
Oh,
a total feat. And then part of it too is that the streaming era has made it a really different thing. It almost doesn't
yeah.
matter if someone's made a great album. Our attention, I know I'm not, this is not a hot take, but our attention spans are like, well, I liked their number one song on Spotify or Apple Music. Oh, number two, not really doing it for me, but I'll
Yeah.
take number one and put it on my playlist. So it's just so different,
Yeah,
you
and
know.
there was a classical pianist who I listened to called James Rhodes, who's very good. He's kind of a rock and roll classical pianist, smokes on stage and wears jeans and things. And he said that years and years ago, he went back and ripped all of his CDs to put them on his iPod when that came out, but then found that he was doing exactly that. He was just sort of creating playlists. So he said, well, I'm going to stop doing that and I'm going to go back to CDs, because then you find you forget, oh yeah, Rhino Skin is an amazing song, or All Right
Yeah,
Now is an amazing song, and I've forgotten about that because I'm listening to Running Down a Dream, or I'm listening
yeah,
to, so going back to listen to albums, which I've gone back to vinyl even. it's just so much better because you rediscover all these old songs you'd forgotten about.
Yeah, and you give artists more of a chance too. I'm afraid to say I don't buy CDs too much anymore, but I try to listen as though I'm listening to CDs
Yeah,
because I think if you've bought it, I've I bought a lot of used CDs, and even if they're like $2, you still have that amount of investment in it. So
yeah,
you'll listen through the whole thing, and then even if it's not love at first listen, you'll listen through again, and maybe it's track seven, maybe it's Rhino Skin, whatever.
yeah,
Maybe it's that song that flips the switch and you're like, oh my God, where has this been?
yeah,
Whereas, on Spotify, it's like, well, you're not digging it. You're not paying anything specifically to listen to Echo. So why bother listening through to track seven?
yeah,
And then you never fall in love with an artist who could have meant something to you. So it's
yeah.
definitely a loss. I mean, I never want to sound like an old guys in my day, but it's different. It's different.
Yeah. Well, and it is important because when I talk to, because I've got kids now, and it's not, it is the tendency to say, well, it was better in my day. Well, no, it wasn't better because the people before you would have said the same. It's just different. And so, as a
Yeah.
young artist or as a new artist and an independent artist, you've got to navigate waters that Petty never even had to dream about, right? But okay, so you're in San Francisco. Is that, have I got that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Is
Correct.
that where so you've born and raised there? Is that where you sort of spent most of your life, or?
Yeah, been away for college, spent a few other stints, especially early COVID in other places, but San Francisco through and through, basically.
And what was home like? What was the music like in your house when you were growing up?
Um, very supportive for music. My mom especially encouraged me and my sister to play. Encourage might be too light a word. She really, the carrot and the stick. I would say both were put into
Yeah.
play occasionally. Um, but we both played violin, classical violin. We're
Okay.
not rock and roll classical musicians. No jeans, no cigarettes on stage. At least not as a 5-year-old. Um, uh, and then yeah, there was a lot of music in the house, a lot of music in the car.
Yeah.
In my mom's car, we always had a CCR greatest hits. We had a Hank Williams greatest hits. My dad, I remember a Bob Marley greatest hits. The Joshua Tree, which I sort of consider the album, sort of, I mean, this is simplification, but I think of it as the reason I play music, listening to the Joshua Tree. Um,
Okay.
and Stones, I believe there was a best of Sting solo CD, which was
Okay.
more questionable than the rest of those, but he has his moments, his post-police moments, that is.
Sure does.
So anyway, yeah, a lot of music in the house. Um, I started taking an interest in guitar after really getting into rock music, especially U2 and the Stones. As as makes sense, the guitar diverted my attention away from classical violin, uh, because night and day, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I think this was a little bit of a disappointment to my mom, much in the same way that I think she still wishes I was pursuing some kind of engineering
Yep.
instead of music. Sorry, mom. But ultimately they became super supportive. They drove me to 2 to 3 open mics every week
Yeah.
when I was in middle school and early high school before I could drive, and really could not ask for better support from them.
So those early gigs then, or open mics and things, is that's just you, an acoustic guitar, doing sort of covers, or were you sort of starting to write back then, or?
It was actually great for it started out very much covers. First few months were probably there were Talking Heads, some Dylan, some Paul Simon.
Okay.
American Girl was one of the first. Uh, but yes, already by a couple months in, I was writing, and uh, it was great because I would try to have a new song for every week. You
Right.
come back. It was this bookstore that was also a coffee house, little club. Club's the wrong word. Performance space.
Yep.
I'd try to have something new every week. It was kind of the OG come up with a new song for Instagram every week. It's like, no, I went there and wanted to have something new for the folks nursing their chai lattes. You don't want to rehash anything.
Well, there's two things there. I mean, one is that when you take that on, which you could have just gone and done covers, like no one would have minded. I'm sure it would have been fine, right? But you then sort of build a discipline for the work, which is as important as creativity is that sort of work ethic, being able to do that. And then the second is you said that you got up on stage and you were doing talking heads. Like
Yeah.
what kid does talking heads with an acoustic guitar on stage? That's insane. What songs?
Well, they're the very first two songs I did ever in public. It was supposed to be Psycho Killer and then Heaven, which is the first two songs on Stop Making Sense.
Yeah.
But I got there, and as you can probably deduce from my mention of the chai latte, you can probably imagine I got there and I'm thinking, okay, I don't know if Psycho Killer is the right lead off track here. So I ended up doing Heaven and then Psycho Killer. Um, and doing Talking Heads with an acoustic guitar, period, is kind of a bit of a fool's errand because they're such a not acoustic
No, not
guitar
at all.
band, and they're not really a chordal band. A lot of their best known songs don't literally don't even have chord changes.
Yeah.
It's about the interplay of some couple dozen
Yeah.
overdubs. So yeah, those two songs work better than others, but yeah, I think I'm trying to think what the first Dylan songs I might have done, maybe Blowing in the Wind or
Yeah.
Knocking on Heaven's Door. Those are more conventional choices.
Well, they're standards. They're good for they're accessible for people listening with their child lattes,
Yeah,
right? They're going to understand. I understand that. What is this
yeah,
psycho killer? Why is this?
yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So,
Yeah.
but let's jump in a little bit forward there because there's a link with Talking Heads in your career, a formative, very important link. You would discovered it will like I don't like using that word, but Jerry Harrison from Talking Heads sort of noticed you and wanted to work with you. What was that experience like?
I don't think I've even quite processed it yet, and here we are going on, God, well over a decade later, and I,
Yeah,
I still think I should probably be, ecstatic about it. And I think it's sort of jarring that I know this person because as a
yeah,
kid, we rented Stop Making Sense from the local video rental store, and just a brief interjection about physical media. Isn't it
yeah.
cool that you would go there and you'd see a movie cover, a poster, and think like, wow, I wonder what that is. Let's try that. And that's
And
again
sometimes they
something
wouldn't
that's
have it.
lost.
Sometimes they wouldn't have it,
Yeah,
so you'd have to go back the next week and see if it was there again, right? So,
totally. Yeah. Oh, it's so, and I miss the whole logistics of being done with dinner, and we'd
yeah.
be thrilled when our folks would say, "Oh, let's walk down." Video Droid. That was the name of the store, Video Droid. Let's walk down, and it was a 15-minute walk, and we'd pick something,
Yeah.
uh, my mom was mortified when we wanted to watch The Simpsons, but she had never seen it, and then she ended up being kind of the biggest fan of it. But anyway, so we got Stop Making Sense, and it's a week-long rental, and we end up watching it every night of that
Yeah.
week that we had it. I was just totally blown away. It's just such an inventive and unparalleled, brilliant interdisciplinary work of art. I
Yeah.
can't say enough about it. But anyway, obviously I knew what they looked like. I'd watched these people on screen for 20 hours at this
Yeah.
point, cumulatively between all those viewings. And I'm sitting there in our hometown, and Jerry Harrison walks by, and for me, it might as well have been Tom Cruise or something because I've
Yeah.
watched more Jerry Harrison screen time than Tom Cruise screen time. And I think, in fifth grade at this time, and I would say just that working with him, the idea of working with him is still it's still sort of surreal to me that he's someone I know
Yeah.
and can text about something. So maybe I've kind of suppressed how how incredible it is because to be a
Yeah.
human being, you have to suppress the insanity of life, and that's part of the insanity for me.
Yeah, like
Um,
to be able to text one of the guys who played on Remain in Light, that's just too big. That's too big for someone to have in their brain at one time.
yeah.
But when did he? So, what did he see you playing? Like, where did he see you play that he thought, I got to talk to this guy?
Well, I probably just became a bit of a pest, and he thought if you swat the fly, it's better than letting it bug you forever.
Yeah.
Because I just started seeing him around town, and I was playing at open mics in our hometown, and I would play Talking Head songs, and maybe in a moment of poor judgment by him, he decided to reach out and ask if we could do some songs together. And of course, I said yes, and I went in maybe literally that week into a studio he had, and we recorded demos of the 50 songs that I had,
Wow.
um, and just me and acoustic guitar, nothing
Yeah.
polished beyond that. And then he and his engineer Eric Thorngren, they chose 15 of those songs, and then we did full recordings of them. Most of them are still unreleased. That's actually one of my
Oh, okay.
sort of big my sort of bucket list always sounds kind of morbid, but one of my goals is to revisit those, probably re-sing the vocals because the existing vocals are very sort of Alvin and the Chipmunks, and put out the full album as
Yeah.
we want it to be. So anyway, that's a dream for hopefully the next couple of years. Right now, he's not only promoting the re-release of Stop Making Sense, the theatrical re-release,
Yeah.
but also touring Remain in Light with Adrian Belew, the guitarist who appears on that record.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So, and it's great. I've seen it twice, the tour, and it's great.
Yeah.
It's as good as you could see those songs without it being Talking Heads, I think. So
Yeah.
anyway, all of that is to say, I think he's pretty otherwise disposed right now, but I'm hoping in the new year and beyond, maybe we can be looking at revisiting those recordings.
That's super cool, man. Yeah. So then your first album that you do release was Blast Off in 2015, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So but if I'm reading right, you played with one of the Heartbreakers. Was that on that album?
No, that was
I
on the
didn't
Jerry
think so.
album.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, by Blast Off, I was playing with my own band. The
Yeah.
drummer, of which I still play with, we're playing tonight, in fact. And that's been a very gratifying thing to have such a long-standing creative and personal connection with someone. Um, uh, yeah, so Steve Ferrone was on that, and it's yeah, as we were just saying, it's very surreal that I was working with Jerry. It might even be more surreal that I had Ferrone on a record.
Yeah.
I so it's really good that at the time I was actually not yet a super fan.
Yeah.
I I had already seen the Super Bowl halftime show, which is why I started becoming a fan, but I wasn't, we keep coming back to the song, but I wasn't a Rhino Skin level fan yet
Yeah.
by any stretch. And that's probably good because had I been in a room with Steve Ferrone at that level of fandom, I think it only could have negatively impacted sort of the earnestness
Yeah.
and innocence. It's sort of a weird word to use in connection to myself, but like there's an innocence to the approach and to the songwriting. Like
Of course. Yeah.
uh, innocence, what I'm really going for is lack of self-consciousness. Like what a beautiful thing. You could
Yeah.
even connect it to what we were saying, like can you watch a movie without knowing who the director is? In the same way, like in your own creativity, can you take your ego out of it? And I think as you get older and older, that becomes more and more challenging.
I think though that there are musicians who are really good at that, and Steve Ferrone is one of them, right? Because I'm sure Steve Ferrone gets this call and says, "Hey, do you want to come play drums on this kid's track?" And Steve says, "Yeah, okay," and comes down, and I'm sure had no ego about it, contributed, was great to work with. You probably just this big happy guy behind the kit. But that to me is
Yeah,
sort of all the heartbreakers. You get that sense that they care about the music. It's not the glitz and the glamour, it's the music, right? So as long as there's that musical connection that they can find with you, then that ego thing's probably going to get put out of the way pretty quickly, I would imagine.
totally. That I think uh, that sort of self-effacing nature is so central to the sort of ethos of that band.
Yeah.
And I've been lucky to play with a lot of people who embody that. It's drama is so stereotypical of a rock band, and
Yeah.
there's just no place for it in a functional creative setting.
I did an interview with someone, Sheldon Dingwall, who's a luthier, makes world-class bass guitars here in the town that I live in, Saskatoon. And he said that he was talking to Leland Sklar one time, the
Uh-huh.
famous bass player. And he said,
Yeah.
"Have you got any?" He said, "If I'll give you one piece of advice as a musician, it's always be a good hang, because that's how you get
Uh-huh.
hired, right? Especially if you're a session musician, people want to work with you. If you're a dick and you're hard to work with, no one's going to call you again, right? So that idea, and again, like I said, I think apart from one of the Heartbreakers, famously, who caused a little bit of tension in the end,
Yeah.
I think mostly they were pretty good
You
guys.
know, well, I'd love to know more about that story. It's
Yeah,
one of it's always you sort of know there's some event or some simmering thing, but in the narrative, it's
yeah,
ultimately sort of glossed over,
for sure. Yeah,
which
Zane's
is
book
probably
even
for the best.
absolutely, and
Yeah.
don't pick old wounds, right? I mean, it's not the time
Yeah.
to do it, but to be a fly on the wall in some of those conversations when you've got personalities that strong, you think, ooh, and you probably think, Ron Blair's just sitting back thinking, nothing to do with me. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
cool. Let's talk a little bit then, because going through when I sort of got connected with you a couple 3 weeks back, whatever it was, I of course then started listening to your music and Blast Off. Great debut album, but it's very sort of, I think there's like almost this punk aesthetic in it. It's very rock and roll, very guitar forward. Then you move on to California's Burning, which sort of a continuation. Spirit
Yeah.
Catches You is the first time I think there's a few little bits of things now where he's starting to spread his wings a bit and get a bit better. But then the album that I listened to first actually was Undertold. And there's a gap between Spirit Catches You and Undertold of 3 years. And obviously the pandemic happens in that time. But I wanted to ask you, and I don't know if I'm on the mark with this, but it feels like something happened in your life in that intervening time, because the tone on Undertold between that and Spirit Catches You, it's a bit darker. You're just sonically, you're in a different space, like you're incorporating a lot more synth in there. There's different elements coming in. So was there something that happened in that time that sort of was a trigger for that happening?
Well, yeah, totally. I think the main, I mean, there are personal life events too, but and I could chalk it up to things, but if I'm being honest, I think it's really just was sort of conceiving of the production without the trying to find the most diplomatic word, but
Okay.
without sort of the I don't know, albatross maybe. That's probably not the most diplomatic, but sort of the albatross of live performance. It's like all of a sudden,
Right.
it's like, okay, we're not worried about oh, I shouldn't use the royal we. I should say I was not worried about how am I going to perform these songs live. Like,
Yeah.
yes, we'll reverse engineer them. We'll say, here's a song that we don't need to perform it like this. We'll take it back. We'll rearrange it so a power trio can do it.
Yeah.
Um, but I no longer wanted to be constrained in the studio by um, how something was performed on stage. Already, as you noted, there's already a gap between California's Burning and Spirit Catches You. Spirit
Yeah.
Catches You already, expands from like sort of live band in the studio to like, okay, what sound are we going for?
Yeah.
But it's still like a band album with elements added. But then, as you noted, like it goes from here to here for Undertow, where it's like maybe it doesn't even sound like a band. Maybe it's not supposed to sound like a band. And um, since things that had never appeared on stage with me before, it just it's sort of a cliche with George Martin and the Beatles, but the studio did become an instrument, And
Yeah,
that's so exciting. You know, and I've shouted him out every time I've talked about this, but I have to do it again. My
yeah.
friend and producer James DePreto, who's just a phenomenal musician and, may I say, a great hang. Uh, uh, he's so responsible for that because I would go in, and when I would take a song with my acoustic guitar and play it for my band, we would say, okay, how can we perform this? Whereas with him, I would play a song and he would say, how can we record this?
Yeah.
And then it would be, okay, is it best if it stays an acoustic song? Is it best if there's a string quartet? Is it best if there's no guitar on the entire track?
Yeah.
So stuff like that.
So that's a different. That's a different discipline thing, right? So I mean, I always draw that parallel with Petty too, where by the time they get to Long After Dark, which is 41 years old today, amazingly,
Oh,
they
wow.
they just knew how to make records at that point, right? They knew what the studio was, they knew who they were in the studio and how to sort of do different things. Like, yeah, you got lucky. So now they're going to bring in synths and they're going to make something that sounds like nothing else. So I think that having that freedom, I think part of it is born by just having been in the studio, right? Because you see those opportunities beyond just the power trio thing. And a friend of mine always says that, because he writes, quite complex arrangements. And he says what you basically end up doing in that situation is you write the song, record it, and then to do it live, you do a cover version of it. So you're covering your own song in a sense, right? So
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah, totally. And yeah, what you're saying about like understanding the studio, what you can do. I mean, that's such a like when I was recording with Jerry, I this sounds so naive, but I didn't realize you could make choices. Like I thought you just went in and this is how it sounded because you're in a recording studio.
yeah,
Um, and it's like, oh no, you can do anything you want,
yeah,
for better or for worse. I am a believer that constraints are actually the friend of creativity, but
of course.
that's another conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And I
Yeah.
should say I got them mixed up too. So it was Kintsugi. It's Kintsugi. Is that how you pronounce it? Kintsugi.
Yeah, that more or less, yeah,
Yeah.
kintsugi.
That was the one that's a little bit darker, where Undertold it's got a little bit more of a upbeat. It's a bit quicker tempo overall, I would say. Apart from you got one track in the middle, but obviously were they written at the same time and sort of conceived as two halves of the same type of thing?
I'm not so much, I like to say they are because it's kind of fun. Like,
Yeah.
George Lucas says he knew about all six Star
Ah,
Wars movies when he was making the first. But,
yeah.
but you know, but no, it was really supposed to be one album, but then there were more songs and really made sense as one album.
Okay.
And to your point about them having stylistic differences, it became sort of fun to think like, okay, half of this is becoming sort of a little sleeker, like influenced by a sort of 80s new wave thing. And
Yeah.
then, so that's Undertowed. And then Kintsugi was a little, I would say more similar to the prior record, more a broader sort of pop instrumentation, um, but still, still conceivably performed as a band instead of like sort of an
Yeah.
entire overhaul.
But it's also like thematically, yeah, cut me down the middle, shape of fear, enough bad luck, save your sorrow, hurt me now. Like lyrically, it feels like it's a dark sort of, or not maybe dark, but
Sure.
plaintive and introspective, as opposed to being a little
Yeah.
bit more focused on that sort of melodic element, maybe.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. I did uh, I guess sort of a series, I guess sort of a video podcast where my band performed three or four songs, and then we talked with the person filming it, and he said how he thought my lyrics sort of like just came to the edge of being personal, but sort of
Yeah.
didn't like dive into it. And you hate to hear people say anything constructive criticism,
Yeah.
uh, especially people related to you. My mom sends me texts when she has something to say that are, you have an iPhone and the texts are like three iPhone lengths, and I'm like, oh God, let's not talk about it. But he said this, and it for whatever reason it broke through the defense mechanisms of not listening to advice or
Right.
criticism. And I thought, I think um, I think his name's Tom, actually, coincidentally. Like, Tom, I think you're actually right. I haven't allowed myself to hit somewhere deeper. So I think for maybe that's what you're hearing on Kintsugi is me trying to push through whatever that membrane was
Yeah.
and sort of turn an eye in on myself, I guess.
But cut me down the you open with cut me down the middle. There's one thing that I always obsess about track listing and sequencing. You always seem to pick really good opening songs. Because that one for me, that was the first song I listened to. That was the first song I threw
Oh,
on.
cool.
And so cut me down the middle, take whichever half you like. It's like, well, that's such a petty-esque line. Like, I'm in. This guy, I like his
Thanks.
voice. I love that line. I'm in. And then you get those big sort of Campbell-esque accents in the song that, okay, yeah, this guy's definitely a rock and roller. There's shades of other things in there, but he's definitely rock and roll. So
Uh,
I can find where this is. And I get, you've got like shades of the Killers in there, and there's even like Cyndi Lauper sometimes with some of the vocal phrasing. So
oh,
it's all
cool.
this mishmash, this blend of other people that I hear, right? And I always wonder whether I should say that to people. Oh, I hear this and I hear that, because if someone's not a fan, that might be an insult. But again, it's just sort of it's that sort of cumulative effect of just hearing everything that comes in and taking it either subconsciously or consciously. So
Yeah, I've never. I'm trying to think if I've ever been had someone say been compared to someone and really felt bad about it. I don't know. I think it always comes from a nice place. Like
yeah,
it'd have to take like a real sort of misanthrope to come up to you, and they exist, but like after a show and be like, you know who you remind me of? You remind me of Elton John, and I hate Elton John. It's like, okay, like
yeah.
shouldn't you be writing political screeds on Facebook right now or something?
They probably
Um,
are as well.
they probably, yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I tend to think that if someone comes up with a comment like that, it's 99 times out of 100 going to be a positive, at least coming from a good place.
Yeah,
So,
for sure. And then, so I mean, your last album, White Roses in the Snow, again, you've taken that next step now where it almost feels like you've given yourself license to just go whatever direction you want, and you're going to use, because the opening track again is very electronic, and now, so I was trying to think of the way I would describe your music to my listeners and people who are maybe not sort of up with a little bit more of the sort of the current pop aesthetic. And I'd written down somewhere that I think your skin is sort of that modern pop sensibility, but your skeleton and muscles are all firmly rock and roll, because that underpins the attitude and the sort of structure of most of the songs. It's rock and roll. You can find where that is if you listen carefully and if you listen properly. So
I may have to put that on my website. That seems like that feels very right. I what I always say is that rock and roll is like the gravitational center. Like we push at it, we try to
yeah,
be, cartoonish, like the way that Wile E. Coyote can like, go beyond his skin and whatnot. But it is, as you say, it's absolutely the skeleton. And when I write a song, it's as though it's going to be a rock and roll song. We take it other places, but and I think with the next record that we're mixing right now, it is going to take a bit of a step back towards rock and roll.
okay,
I think I'm always curious how far we can push it, but I think some of the tracks on White Roses were the maybe the logical extreme of how much of a not rock song it could be while
right,
still, you know, uh, genetically being kind of a rock song.
yeah.
Phenotypically, like we get kind of weird, and I'd still love to push the envelope and not never settle because it seems like the easiest thing to do. But a lyric I love from have you ever heard of Ted Leo? Do you know him at all?
I don't.
Uh, Regardless, he has a lyric that says, "Sometimes the path of least resistance will gain you the most," and I think that's great.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's only an exercise in futility to try to do the weird thing. Sometimes
yeah.
the simple thing is the right thing.
But it's that same thing that Tom always had, and you definitely have, is I believe what you're saying. It's not a contrivance. It's not a deliberate sort of conceit to try to sound a certain way, to do a certain thing. It's just that that's the way you've written the song and that's the way you've decided that it should sound, but it comes across as being completely authentic. But I did
Yeah,
want to ask,
thank
so
you.
just a song like Just an Echo then. So you said that do you write all your songs on guitar? Do they all start out as sort of guitar songs or?
Uh, almost exclusively. If I hit a real sort of impasse, moving to another instrument is
Okay.
can be a way to fight through, but almost all guitar, yeah.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Well, let's. We've chatted it, and this is the problem when I talk to musicians. I could just talk to you about your work, and then I forget. Oh no, I've got to talk about Tom Petty. So,
Yeah.
so what are your first memories of Tom Petty? Then he said that it's funny because there's another artist that I've talked to, Jake Thistle. I don't know if you're aware of, who also
I
said
am,
that
yeah.
the Super Bowl
Yeah.
show for him, he said that was the one where he sort of, wow, who is this guy with this big stage thing? But as I think you'd written somewhere too, he came out on the Super Bowl stage with that amazing prop stage, but then just played his songs. There was no razzmatazz, there were no dancing girls. He was playing music, and my God, it was powerful.
Yeah. Oh, unbelievable. Like I think at least this is how it looks on TV. We'll need to find the engineers, but it looks like it's two separate pieces.
Yeah,
The flying V guitar and the heart, right? And
I'm pretty
they
sure. Yeah,
actually interlocked like in real time on stage, and then the people are flooding it, and
yeah.
you know, I sound like a total zealot, but I guess I am. The Church of Tom. It's like hearing the opening chords ring out of American
Oh,
Girl. It's like you have to be without a heart, without a soul
yeah,
to not feel moved by that. I mean, it's transcendent. It really
it is.
is. So I went and learned that song immediately to take to that open mic with the chai latte drinkers. And I had to learn my first bar chord. I had to learn a B
Yeah,
minor. Until then, I'd only known open chords.
yeah.
Although this was not my first experience with Petty, I actually learned one of the first songs I ever learned on guitar. Uh, that is to say, one of my first steps towards disappointing my mother, who was, you know, still petitioning for classical violin, was learning Free Fallin', which is an absurdly simple song on guitar, which I say with the as the best thing you could say.
Yeah,
Simple is such, you know, a three chord song that is that good is that's the dream.
yeah.
Complexity is often the enemy of quality in rock and roll and pop music, and it's one of the defining, you know, defining parts of Tom's brilliance
Yeah.
is that he says so much. I don't even really want to say so much with so little because that's not
I,
quite what it is.
I've said that on
But
pretty much 50% of the episodes I've done so far,
yeah,
honestly. I've used the exact phrase
yeah,
because it's exactly right.
yeah. It's so little, but it's so understated too.
Yeah.
Like it almost always makes the choice to to say less. You
Yeah.
almost have to infer the brilliance of it.
Yeah.
Like it's almost sort of like I think of him as having this entire like sort of, you know, I used the word zealot sort of in jest earlier, but I do think of him as having this sort of like very Zen sort of ideology. But what's so great about it is like what he actually says, the hard, the concrete lyrics that we're able to point to. They're almost sort of just like the blueprint of this ideology.
Yeah.
Like it never is rammed down your throat. It's sort of like this beautiful architecture, but it allows the listener to sort of fill in the rooms and bring their own furniture. And that's so beautiful, I think.
Yeah. Well, I just saw the last episode the last song episode I put out last week was Learning to Fly. And that's an amazing example of what you've just said, right? Because there's online in the conversations with other listeners, there's at least three different rock solid sort of opinions about or interpretations of this is what this lyric means to me. And when you read that, you think, yeah, that makes total sense. And it's not what it means to me. But as a songwriter, that's the dream, right? To be able to write a song that connects with
Totally.
people so completely because you've made it broad enough, yet specific enough in that weird way. And Tom was just, I
Yeah.
think, maybe the best of all time at that specific thing that he could do, you know?
You just totally nailed my songwriting sort of philosophy is like make it as specific as you can without uh, without limiting who can relate to it. And I totally agree. I mean, I think, you know, it's like how what imagery can you use that brings something to mind but
Yeah.
doesn't make it, you know, overly personal. I don't mean that in the way of like sharing too much. I mean in the way of like, okay, only you experience that. I can't
Yeah.
put myself in those shoes. And that's usually a bad place to be, I think.
Yeah, and he did it with learning to fly in one way, where I'm learning to fly, but ain't got wings. Coming down is the hardest thing. It can be about tragedy. It can be about some people relate it to drugs, some people relate it to stardom, which is kind of where I've always kind of landed with it. But then there's another way of writing that he did something like Something Big, or Tweeter and the Monkey Man with Dylan, where you've got this, you've set up this soundstage, and you've got the characters there, and you've filled in just enough of the scenery that it's like, I think you were saying something about this same thing earlier, but now the listener fills in, does all the coloring in. So it's like a sketchbook where you've got to fill in. And you've got, I'm going to throw again to one of your songs. There's a phenomenal line. I can't remember which song it's in now, but the clown said to the doctor, I'm feeling a little blue. The doctor said, now listen, man, I'll tell you what we'll do. That is so cinematic that straight away
Thank
that
you.
line just goes, your mind just goes, whoa, where's this going? I want to come along on this ride. So again, that talent to be able to do that is, it always impresses me because I can't do it. So
Well, thank you so much. You brought up Tweeter and the Monkey Man, which I think is actually a great song to investigate with connection to this because it's like it's a highly specific song,
yeah,
as opposed to say Learning to Fly, which is I would have to look at the lyrics, but highly sort of metaphorical,
yeah,
it's imagery. Like it's beautiful imagery, but sort of in a, it's not, there's not like sort of gritty specific images, which is sort of entirely what Tweeter is.
yeah.
So in a way, it's a great, you could say it's a great song that sort of contradicts what I was just saying. Um, but it does this thing which I find is true in all the sort of great narrative rock songs, that it sort of leaves just enough unsaid that you
Yeah.
can listen to it again and again and still sort of wonder why you don't know the full story, like in a really good way. Like my favorite example of this would be Pancho and Lefty, the Townes Van Zandt song,
Yeah.
where it's like it's this brilliant outlaw song, and you kind of like know what happens without knowing what happens.
Yeah.
Um, and Tweeter and the Monkey Man like just it leaves just enough blank space that I never feel like, okay, this story
Yeah.
again.
Well, because there's a whole subplot in it that Dylan just throws away, or Tom, whoever wrote that one line, long before he became a Jersey girl. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa.
Uh-huh.
We're throwing this away now. Is this like, what are we saying here? Is it like Lola from the Kinks? Like, that's a whole plot that we should be digging into, but it's just one line in the song, and it just adds that little bit of texture and that little bit of color that you don't need it in there, but it sure as hell adds a lot to it. So,
Well, and it's true of movies too. It's great when you can suggest, you can probably tell I'm a big Star Wars fan, but it's like, man, wasn't it great when Darth Vader's past was hinted at? We didn't
yeah.
necessarily need three movies to tell us everything. Obviously,
Yeah.
this is a bit of mental gymnastics, but it's true. It's like
Yeah.
if you can strongly suggest a background, a character, an origin story, Tweeter, the Monkey Man, whoever,
Yeah.
Poncho, Lefty, without having to spell it out. That's great storytelling and therefore great songwriting.
Well, it's why Jaws was much, much scarier before you saw the shark. Because once you see the
Totally.
shark, it's like, okay, yeah. I mean, back in the time, obviously the effects were much better than they are now. But before then, that movie's terrifying because it's the suspense of it and it's what's left unsaid. It's the whole jazz thing. It's the notes you don't play sometimes that are more important than the notes you play, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
you said that somewhere on it's either on one of your videos or in an interview I was listening to, that you could make an argument that Echo is Tom's best album. You said like you remember sort of derailing a co-writing session because you just started playing the title track. So what is it about Echo, do you think, that why does that song resonate with Pettyheads, where Tom, as you said, sort of dismissed it, and it came at a very, very bad time in his life where it was difficult, what was going on was difficult, but out of that hurt and that pain comes this unbelievable piece of work that is unheralded in the rock and roll canon, which I just amazes me because it's a staggering piece of work.
Yeah, I being asked like what's my favorite Petty record, that's so tough.
Yeah,
I know you didn't just ask that outright, but I'm thinking of it in that context.
yeah,
And because the two that are always sort of like people's favorites, well, I guess the three, it sort of seems like Torpedoes, Wildflowers, and Full Moon Fever are kind of
yeah,
the three that are like, you're rarely gonna not get one of those
Yeah.
in the top three. I they're certainly wildflowers and torpedoes are some they could be my favorite any day of the week, especially side A of Damn the Torpedoes was like
Oh
for
God.
probably about 10 years I thought side A of Torpedoes was like the greatest thing ever.
Yeah.
And it really kind of is, but I don't know, somehow I don't know what they were going for, but I think that somehow Echo they tapped in to a sort of hybrid of the rock and roll that defined their first four albums
Yeah.
with something that is as relevant to any rock music being made today, and I mean 2023 today,
Yeah.
and maybe my understanding is that Rick Rubin didn't totally produce Echo. He had totally done Wildflowers, and then I think he sort of got them running on Echo, but didn't necessarily finish it with them. So it might have been some confluence of like Petty's rock and roll sensibility with Rick Rubin's very sort of like holistic approach to, if you look at his discography, it's all
Yeah.
over the place.
Yeah.
Uh, but then also with this like hyper intimate, personal songwriting perspective of Wildflowers. It's sort of like all those things coming together. And it's far from a perfect record, but man, it does all the right things. And
Yeah.
its best songs are totally up there with his best music. No doubt
Yeah.
about it.
Well, there's a reason why, when people talk about their favorite deep cuts or songs that non-Tom Petty fans don't know, Room at the Top is always one of the first that you're going to throw onto any sort of playlist for people who are into Petty but don't know the deep cuts, because it's just like who puts it in that big rock and roll jagged guitar riff in the middle of this touching ballad? Well, Tom Petty and Mike Campbell do. That's that's the sort of stuff that the sort of left turns that they're willing to take at this point. But it's also, as you said, I think Rubin. I think you're right. I think Rubin. My understanding is that he was there at the songwriting sessions and sort of helped them, hone what they were doing, but wasn't there for all the recording. I think
Okay.
is what I've
That
read.
that sounds right. Yeah.
But I always
Yeah.
think, but it's part of the trilogy, right? Because there's two main trilogies, and then sort of the Jeff Lynne one as well. But you got the Jimmy Iovine trilogy, Torpedoes through Long After Dark, and then you get Rick Rubin doing Wildflowers, She's the One, and Echo, and those three just sort of sonically and thematically they dovetail so beautifully together that really you kind of have to have the same producer for those three records, right? So,
Yeah. And She's the One is great. I
oh man,
really believe that. It's like it, maybe scrubbing a couple tracks, but like it would be it's a really good album.
yeah,
Since there's several covers and some sort of throwaway stuff, it's easier to overlook. Plus, Jennifer Aniston is on the cover of it, so you don't think of it the same way. But it's a great album. My God,
well,
you
and again,
know,
talking about opening lines, some days are diamonds, some days are rocks. I mean, beat that for an opening line.
yeah,
I don't know how you top that one. That's just incredible. And I was
yeah.
watching you playing because there's an acoustic cover of you doing that one, and what was the second song? Square One on your
Oh
YouTube
yeah,
channel,
yeah.
which was fantastic. Because again, that's where a truly, truly great song, if it's just one voice and one acoustic guitar, you should still be able to do it. Right. And Walls, obviously
Absolutely,
we're gonna
yeah.
talk about Walls a little bit later, obviously, but when you can just do it that stripped down acoustic version, it sounds great. And if you've got any sort of decent voice and you can play, it's a great song to play because, like you said, it's accessible and it's easy. And I think that's what earlier on you were talking about. Tom wrote simply, and it goes back to I read in, and I think it was in Conversations with Tom Petty by Paul Zolo, where he was talking about the Beatles, and everyone at that time said, "Well, I think we can do that. Like we can't do Steely Dan and we can't do these big, massive, complex arrangements or Chicago, but the Beatles and sort of the Stones, that's just four chords and the truth. I can do that." And so Tom never sort of lost that sense of let's strip out all the stuff we don't need, but definitely focus and keep on and make sure what we do need is as perfect as possible.
Absolutely. And since you brought up Square One, I do want to give Highway Companion a shout out because
Oh,
it's an amazing album that will never get bandied about as being one of his great albums.
yeah,
It's sort of a low key, brilliant record. But that's neither here nor there. I totally agree. I think I think he, in a way, I actually, so one of the very classic rock and roll questions is Beatles or Stones, right? We've all
Yeah.
heard that, and I think it's such a funny question because they are totally apples and oranges.
Yeah.
Like they're just, wildly different. And the way I like to describe it is that like what you were sort of just saying about if you have a half decent voice, you can communicate a petty song.
Yeah.
I feel the same way about Beatles songs. Like if you have the sheet music for, yesterday or whatever,
Yeah.
if you can sing and play, you're gonna know that yesterday's a great song. I'm not saying it's gonna sound angelic, but if you can sing on tune and have a sense of rhythm, you'll know that yesterday is great. Whereas the Stones, I do not think of that way. I think they have those songs. I would say Wild Horses, for example, is one of those
Yeah.
songs. But I would say plenty of their great songs, their greatness is predicated on performance, not craft, which is a false dichotomy, I would say. But still, like, take "Miss You" or something
Yeah.
like that. That's Mick being a brilliant performer, but not necessarily a brilliant writer. Um, which is
But
why, like, having a Stones cover band is sort of a scary proposition because it's like I don't know, I don't really want to see someone like pretend to be Mick for an hour and a half,
yeah.
that's just a Halloween costume. Whereas you can pretend to be John or Paul without sort of being, a clown,
Yeah. But
And anyway, go
no,
ahead.
well, I was just
Well,
going to say,
I
you brought up "Miss You," and like I said, I mean, if you played "Miss You" just solo on acoustic, it would kind of suck because you do need
yeah,
the bombast and you do need the performative element of it. That's what carries it. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I actually, I don't. The thing about Tom is that I would say he I think comes down somewhere in the middle of those worlds.
Yeah.
Like I think take Square One. All you need is the half decent sense of rhythm and singing voice to show how great a song that is. But I think he has a snarl that is maybe more snarled than John and Paul ever had, at least during their
Yeah.
Beatles days. I'm trying to think what a good example um, of Tom being Stones-esque, at least in sort of vocal delivery. Um,
Some of the stuff off "Let Me Up" has an element of that because it is that more bluesy jam based stuff. So Tom, sings in that style because that's what the song needs. And obviously they always serve the song first and foremost. But I mean, even like a song like "You Got Lucky," man, like that's got a sneer in the vocal. It's got attitude. It sounds kind of nasty and mean. But he was such a gymnast with his voice too, right? Like that's where it
totally, yeah.
pisses me off sometimes when people who don't know his work thoroughly, like I said, as not one of the zealots, they think, oh yeah, he sounds a bit like Dylan. Yeah, sometimes he did, yeah, but man, like his voice on US 41 and his voice on All Right for Now and his voice on Free Falling, that's three different people. That's three different personas. They don't sound anything alike if you really know music, right? So
Totally. And his the precision of his range is I understand the timbre comparison with Dylan, but
yeah,
the actual vocal approach is leagues different than Dylan.
yeah.
I to me the epitome of that is the title line of The Waiting, like the that rundown. It's like that is really hard to do,
Yeah,
and
100%.
he just nails it.
Yeah, a good it's that thing we always talk about with the Heartbreakers, especially just they were so good technically. And Tom was a phenomenal technical singer. He's never going to be on any of their lists of top 100 singers. But again, it's because he didn't have that crazy top end like Coverdale or Plant, or he didn't have sort of the weird sort of bibbity bop from David Lee Roth or whatever it might be. He always sort of followed them,
Sure.
but every single note he ever sang was just dead on. And like I said, that
Oh,
rundown, the
totally.
waiting,
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
tough to do, man.
It's very, very tough. Tough to do that high too. That's a high G. That's tough to hit, period, much less make part of that vocal riff.
So as a guitarist, then because we haven't talked about as a guitarist, again, Mike Campbell, every Heartbreakers fan knows is probably the most criminally underrated rock and roll guitarist, maybe of all time, because he wrote so many great riffs. He always knew exactly what to play and never blew his own trumpet about it. He never sort of got an ego about it. It just sat in the background and just kept playing riff after riff after lick after lick after solo for what, 45 years?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite Campbell solos are the ones that are either one note throughout, and
Yeah.
I'm talking like the solos on the first side of Damn the Torpedoes are they're almost comical in how simple they are. Like the
Yeah.
solo from Century City is just
Yeah.
literally that hanging on that one sort of bend the entire time. And it's almost, if you're teaching, like I teach some guitar, and like
Okay.
if a kid brings in like Eruption or something, and I'm like, that's fine, but what's really good is this solo that's one note the entire. It's almost comical, but those are great. And then the solos, and this is just true of solos in general, is when it just plays the vocal melody. And the solo in Square One, I think, does that. It's just
Yeah.
the exact vocal melody. And I think it's a slide solo. And
Yeah.
another cliche, but good solos are ones that you can hum. And there's nothing
100%.
wrong with playing with playing the vocal line. If you're serving the
Yeah.
song, you only want to reinforce the vocal line. So
Well, and
yeah,
that's
no,
that's
he's brilliant.
and it's the thing with it, right? I mean, it's what they all did. They all serviced on, because if you listen to Ben Montench can play stride piano and jazz and boogie. We get the best of him. He can tear it up if you need him to. Mike Campbell can shred. I mean, Running Down a Dream. Again, I don't know why that's not getting talked about in the same conversation as Stairway and all these other great solos, because for me it is. But they don't need to do that. It's okay. Well, the song doesn't need that. I'm not going to play all over this. I'm going to sit and play these notes. I mean, how many songs does Ben Mont play just the first and fifth on the organ? And it's exactly what the
Yeah,
song needs, and it adds that tone and that color that the song needs. Because it's that thing of, with Jeff Lynne, when he starts working with Jeff Lynne famously doesn't care about the band, doesn't care about how they're going to play it on stage. All he cares about is, can we make this song as good as this song is, a song as good as this song can be. And when I was going back through Full Moon Fever, there is a lot of guitar on that album, a ton of guitar. You don't notice it if you're not listening with musician ears, because it's mixed very well, but there's like 3 acoustic guitars and an electric guitar and everything else. But it all needs to come together and coalesce into being this coherent song. And they were just brilliant at that as a band, all of them, every single one of them.
yeah, absolutely. I think I'd say maybe my favorite example of that is the chorus of "Here Comes My Girl." It's just like this absolute explosion, obviously exacerbated by, Tom going from sort of the preacher
Yeah.
spoken word build up to the melodic chorus. But that chorus comes through, and it's probably about 5 billion to the power of 10 different guitars and pianos and stuff. And it's, it's, it is totally elimination of ego for so many things to be
Yeah.
happening, and it's just brilliant musicianship, and it's brilliant production. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sure Jimmy Iovine has to be credited with so much of how that's tucked in and
Yeah.
not stepping on toes, and it's greater than the sum of its parts, and there are a lot of parts.
Yeah. But that's, I think, always, I've made this observation before, that Tom was very, very good. And I think Mike as well. I'm sorry to say Tom, but I think Tom and Mike particularly, they were very good about learning from Jimmy Iovine, from, working on with Rick Rubin, working with Jeff Lynne. They took what they needed from each of those different approaches that these different producers had and brought them in and sort of used them when they needed them and dropped them when they didn't. And of course, then you get on to, Mojo, where they're going to go now. They're going to go and record an album live off the floor in their clubhouse, just in their little practice space, with Ryan Oliadi, who's not like a big Hollywood producer, and yet they still come out with this amazing sound and this amazing album. So that whole, that whole discipline and craft of learning and evolving as a studio musician and a live musician, because they are two massively different things. I think it's always that thing of, it shows that this was a band that was serious about music. They weren't, they weren't Kiss. They weren't a marketing machine. They weren't Van Halen. They weren't just there for a good time all the time, And I love Van Halen. I'm not dissing Van Halen, and I'll get in trouble with Corey Morissette listening to this. We're doing that, but it's that thing of, no girls on the bus was the rule for the Heartbreakers for the first, I don't know, 20 years of their life as a band, because the music came first with Tom. Like he was very, very serious about it.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, no, I think Tom doesn't get enough credit for how much he draws from the different uh the different chapters of his career. I think that there are artists where that's sort of intrinsic to our understanding of them.
Yeah.
Bowie easily probably being the most
Yeah.
sort of revered for that. But I'd say Dylan, we think of that as well, from folk singer to electric at Newport Folk
Yeah.
to born again Christian, yada yada
Yeah.
yada. Um, so I think Tom is sort of um, we do him a disservice by not recognizing the different eras. Maybe they're not quite as different as, say, the Bowie eras,
Right.
but I think culturally we still oversimplify who he is. But if you like really took someone's hand and guided them from, from breakdown to refugee
Yeah.
to don't come around here no more to Zombie Zoo. No, to Free Fallen, to Wildflowers, you would hear all these different
Yeah.
things. I mean, maybe you have to have a little bit more of a musician's ear, but some of those are pretty big differences, and it's just not part of the popular narrative
Yeah.
about Tom Petty that he has all these phases when he really does.
Yeah. Well, I wonder with that sometimes too, because I think maybe because he was never extreme in any direction in any part of his life. Like he never did anything crazy on stage. He wasn't a headline grabber. So I think that maybe he just wasn't taken as seriously as, I don't know, like someone like Springsteen maybe. And someone made it, I can't remember who it was now, was talking about, made a good point that, Tom Petty sort of owned California in terms of record sales. Like he was much bigger than Springsteen was in California, where Springsteen was much bigger in the whole sort of, northeastern seaboard, but there's a lot more people there buying records, and there's a
Yeah.
lot more radio stations. There's a lot more, you know what I mean? So I think that he sort of gets almost not forgotten, but he doesn't get put on that same level with those guys just because people aren't as they're not listening, they're not paying attention to what he's doing.
Yeah, I know it's funny to put it that way, but and it's funny to talk about Springsteen and Tom in a conversation because they're so similar in so many sort of like on paper ways,
Yeah,
like sort of a bit of a like populist personality with a lot of profundity to be drawn from like a fairly simple presentation.
yeah,
And yet you know, I think Bruce is great, but I've never loved him unconditionally, whereas I feel like I love Tom unconditionally. And I couldn't tell you exactly why this is.
yeah,
There's some intangible to it, but I think it connects to what I said earlier about how music, we need to identify with it in a way that we don't necessarily need to with books or movies.
yeah.
Um, and somehow I want to be like Tom. Uh, I want to learn from Bruce, but I don't really want to be like Bruce. Um,
It's a great way of putting it. It's a great way of putting it. Yeah, and I understand completely what you mean. Yeah,
yeah. And maybe it's just that Tom, I think, maybe always held on to some underdog energy,
yeah,
scrapping it out, whereas Bruce is more the center of attention at times. So I guess I just relate more to
yeah.
Tom's thing.
Well, and
Bruce has countless brilliant songs, so that's
of
not
course,
the
yeah.
slightest denigration of him.
But even, and I've talked to other people about this again, that I think where Petty sort of edges it for most of his contemporaries in that sort of older rock star is, or rock performer, is that his late catalog didn't taper. You know what I mean? He didn't sort of just
Totally.
start phoning it in, because the last DJ, Mojo, Hypnotic Eye, as your last three albums, dear God, I mean, most people would love that as the only three albums they ever wrote, because all three of those albums are phenomenal in different ways and totally unique and totally different. But Hypnotic Eye, that's not the work of someone who's on the downswing at all, you know?
Oh yeah, it makes his passing that much more crushing.
Yeah.
I think that our as a society, our how we respond to celebrity death is very weird. Um, but I think it's very vindicated in the sense that he had so much more to give.
Yeah.
You know, it's crushing that those are each song that he could have written is a
Yeah.
death, you know.
Okay, well, awesome. So let's wrap things up by letting people know what you're up to, where they can find you, what's coming. You got a new album coming out. And when's that
Yeah,
coming out?
I believe we are gonna start putting out singles towards the end of this year, December, hopefully.
Okay.
Um, it's once again trying to think of the songs as how can we best do the songs, and then think about music about the stage, reverse engineer, almost covering your own music, as you
Yeah.
said earlier. Um, so that's happening. Lots of local gigs, also working on some touring of California, hoping to tour much more broadly than that in the near future, though that's a bit more of a question mark currently.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean it's all online, you know. It's please reach out. It's wonderful to interact with people online. I wish that I saw people at the merch table more, but
Yeah.
my God, it's self-defeating to not embrace the contemporary modes of communication. So it's wonderful to connect online.
Yeah. Well, we got and the other thing you got to do, dude, is, like CDs. I've got to buy a couple of CDs from the website, but I'm a vinyl hound. I just got my red vinyl reissue of Mojo. You got to get some of these albums on vinyl
Okay.
for us old guys.
Yeah, I would like to. I think I need a critical mass of prospective vinyl buyers before I can make the leap. But I would like to. I would
Yeah.
like to.
And I would say to my listeners, yeah, go check out Matt. You must be on social media, I'm assuming, all over
Yeah, yeah,
the regular platforms, and then go to Matt's
yeah.
website. If you're looking for a way in, and I'm going to share one of the songs that I'm going to share for I think the Tom Petty Faithful. And if you want to sort of get into Matt's music, I thought Meet Me at Midnight was one that I thought, and you've talked about side one of Torpedoes. That song to me sonically kind of fits with some of the songs on that
Yeah,
side. And I think
cool.
that'll be an easy way in for people to get into your music. So I'm going to share some of
Yeah,
that stuff.
awesome.
Matt, thanks so much
Great.
for taking time out. It's been
Oh,
wonderful
thank
to meet you. And
you.
I'm
Thank you.
consider me a fan now. Like I said, I found my way into your music really, really quickly because I could find lots of little connections to music that I already love. And I'm interested to see where you take it and what the new album sounds like.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. And yes, hopefully we meet in person down in Gainesville. That'd be fantastic.